Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. What role does Switzerland play as one of the 193 members of the United Nations General Assembly? What is Switzerland doing to combat climate change, to eliminate poverty, and to empower women? My guest today is going to bring us up to date on a very interesting country that plays a vital role at the United Nations. My guest today is His Excellency, the Ambassador of Switzerland, Jurg Lauber, and he is the permanent representative of Switzerland to the United Nations. Your Excellency, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you much, Bill. Thanks for having me on the show.
I appreciate you being with me today. Let's start off. Everybody's heard of Switzerland, I'm sure, and they know where it is, but just jog our memory. Where is Switzerland located? How large is it? What is the population?
We like to think of Switzerland as being in the heart of Europe. It's pretty much in the heart of what we call the Western Europe. It's not a very large country. It's surface-wise, it's about 40,000 square kilometers. That's you're from Kentucky, right? It's about half the size of Kentucky.
Yes,
it has about 8.5 million inhabitants. That's about the size of New York City, actually. But it's also, I think, about twice of what is Kentucky. So it's relatively densely populated, not as densely as New York, but relatively densely also because about 2/3 of Switzerland is mountains. A lot of people know that. They know the Alps in Switzerland. So only roughly 1/3 of Switzerland is really flat land, and most of the population is in that part, so it's fairly densely populated.
Now, Switzerland, New York is the #1 headquarters for the United Nations. The majority of the agencies are here. They all have a presence in New York. But Switzerland, Geneva, is the second largest organization for the United Nations, is it not?
It's the European seat. You know, it came out of the League of Nations. They had the League of Nations was in Geneva, and then after the war, it developed into the European seat of the United Nations. It's in fact, with regard to global governance, is actually the biggest center globally. You know, besides the United Nations, it has a number of other international organizations. We host 35 international organizations in Geneva. So, and the whole community is about 45,000 people, internationals. That's a sizable mid-size Swiss town, actually.
And one of those Jeopardy questions is, where is the Universal Postal Union located? And it's located in Bern, Switzerland, and that's a major player in the world to bring the postal authorities together to help move mail safely around the world.
And much more these days. You know, postal services are also money transfers. A lot of services depending on postal physical presence of post offices. It's actually still a very contemporary, modern organization.
Exactly. Well, let's shift gears and move to New York, to the UN General Assembly. The UN deals with literally hundreds of major issues every day. In fact, issues that touch our lives that we don't hear about, like moving mail safely around the world, or moving aircraft, ships, weather information safely around the world. But they are dealing with war and peace, economic and social development, and human rights. From Switzerland's standpoint, what are your 4 or 5 major issues that you focus on at the United Nations? I know you're involved in many, many areas, probably dozens, scores maybe, but what are the 3 or 4 that you really focus on?
You said it yourself. It's really, I mean, the UN basically covers everything. The mandate is very general, very large. But it has 3 main pillars substance-wise, and we are very active in all the 3 pillars. So peace and security for one. Our focus is mostly on conflict prevention and mediation, not so much in the hard security. So we try to strengthen the UN in their capacities for conflict prevention. We send our own mediation experts. We host mediation conferences, peace conferences in Geneva. That's some of our contributions. We're active in peace building meaning reconstructing societies after conflict. I myself am active in what we call the country configuration of the Peace Building Commission for Burundi. So I travel to Eastern Central Africa a couple of times per year. That's in this area probably what I can say is our focus. In the development part, it's really all about implementation of the new development agenda, the 2030 agenda. I think that everybody is really concentrating on that. We are trying to contribute through our national implementation, and maybe we can get back to that later, but also in trying to help strengthen the UN and to help the UN find their role in the implementation of this agenda. How can the UN do better helping member countries implement the agenda? With regard to human rights, the 3rd big pillar, we've been very active for a long time, trying there again to strengthen the institutions within the UN. You know that the UN Rights Council, which is the main body for human rights within the UN system, is in Geneva. We helped set that up. We're very active there. One area we're also active is the whole management part of the UN, and UN reform, strengthening the UN, making it more efficient, more effective, making it an attractive employer also, something we try to contribute. And then one last aspect, an issue we are very strongly, and I'm personally very strongly engaged right now, is the issue of migration. There is currently work on what we call a global compact on migration. It's an intergovernmental process which is facilitated by the Mexican ambassador and I. We're working on this. Target date is summer next year. That's something that we're very much at the focus of my work right now.
You have some very difficult and complex issues that you're dealing with. Congratulations. That's exactly what we need, the countries of the world, to focus on these problems and to try to improve the situation. There are so many different ones you mentioned. Let me just go back to Burundi. How is the situation in Burundi? Is it improving? We heard about Burundi a couple of years ago. We haven't heard as much, or I haven't. Maybe I need to hear. Yeah. But is the situation improving? And what role is the UN playing to help the Burundians get their lives back on track?
It's a difficult situation politically, but ultimately, the Burundians themselves have to decide what the future of their country is. I think what the UN can do and is good at doing is helping the population directly to strengthen the resilience of the population economically. So investing in programs for health, improving the productivity of the agricultural sector, making sure that children can go to school. But then also trying to help them with the political side, finding to each other, being able to dialogue. That's what the UN does well. And the peace-building configuration I have the privilege to chair is really trying to pull from within the UN system all the positive forces, those who can contribute technical expertise or resources, to bring it together and to help support Burundi in their way to sustaining peace.
And of course, that's critical, to be a facilitator and a coordinator, to bring the people who have the expertise, the resources, whatever it may be, managerial resources, financial, on across the board, together to work on these particular problems. Now, the UN still has, over the years, UN peacekeeping was never mentioned in the UN Charter, but right after the Charter ink dried, the UN got into peacekeeping in 1948. And it's been in peacekeeping ever since. There are currently 15 missions, some in some very dangerous areas of the world. If you look at the Democratic Republic of Congo, South Sudan, and many others, what role does Switzerland play in that, in supporting UN peacekeeping?
I myself was a peacekeeper. I actually started. I started as a peacekeeper before even I joined the diplomatic service. I was a peacekeeper in Namibia. It's almost 30 years ago, and that really. That was really one very tiny wheel in a big machine, but it certainly gave me an appreciation for what these people do on the ground and what it means to be there on the ground. And I think it's still, the UN is so much more, but if you look at peacekeeping, it's still probably one of the really core businesses of the UN, and also the blue helmet is still a fantastic trademark, and what these people do on the ground is really, really very important. What seems to me also important is that we start to get a more comprehensive idea of peace. We talk a lot about sustaining peace, looking at all the elements of peace, and also looking at peace long term. What does it need? What do we need to prevent conflict? What do we need to support peace in times of conflict? And what do we need to do afterwards to sustain peace long term?
That is so very important. And of course, the role of the peacekeeper has changed since 1948 to today. It's no longer just separating warring parties, but it's being much more involved in this evolutionary process that you talked about. And that is so critical. That peacekeeping, there are, I guess right now, about 110,000 peacekeepers and 15 missions, maybe a little smaller than that, police units operating. But overall, outside of a handful of some bad players who have violated the military code of ethics and have violated the UN rules and that type of thing, but overall UN peacekeeping has been relatively successful, has it not? When you look back over the last 60-some years it's been operating, it's had setbacks along the way, it's had problems, but still, if the UN weren't there, what would the situation look like in the Democratic Republic of Congo, or what would it have looked like in Haiti?
Yeah, I'm glad you're saying that. I think that's exactly the point. I mean, it had in so many places it had a stabilizing force. It's also sometimes an issue of our expectations. Sometimes we expect just too much. If you look at some of the countries where they are deployed, they're fantastically huge. The forces are usually quite limited, and we have so many expectations. And as you said, it's not just about peacekeeping. We have expectations with regard to human rights and rebuilding of institutions and et cetera, et cetera. Sometimes we need to manage our expectations. But all in all, I agree with you. It's a success story.
That's very, very true. And you look at the number of peacekeepers. Well, you're in Namibia, and I'm sure you could have used more peacekeepers, but they're like 19,000 in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which sounds like a great large number. New York has more police than the peacekeepers, and that's in an area about as big as the eastern half of the United States. So you're right. The expectations don't always meet with reality sometimes, and that's very, very true. Another item that you had mentioned is the development agenda for 2030. What exactly is that? What's the purpose of it? I know there's 17 sustainable development goals, but what is the thrust behind it?
It's really a new way of approaching this whole issue of development in a more universal way, meaning we're looking basically at all the challenges that are out there. 17 goals is a lot, but we look at everything, development, but also look at the link between social, economic development and sustainable development in terms of environmental development, environmental protection. We look at human rights issues, good governance issues, at peace and security issues. We try to bring this all together. And really, it's also a sort of a new contract between the people and the governments. It's like it's a promise of the governments to the people of the world that no one is being left behind, and we all need to work together on these goals on a national basis. So, under the SDGs, every country is a developing country because every country under these 17 goals has issues to improve. And then, of course, the other level is the cooperation. How can we help each other to implement these goals?
Exactly. And these goals, and you're absolutely right, all 193 countries are now participating in this, where under the old Millennium Development Goals, it was just economically developing countries. And these goals want to eliminate poverty, eliminate hunger, empower women, combat climate change, promote sustainable development, keep the oceans clean, and this is a major challenge just with between the air, the water, and the land. But it is all inclusive this time.
It is, and it has to be, because I think what we've already also come to realize is that all these issues are interdependent. You can't have sustainable economic development if you neglect the environment. You can't have all of this if you don't develop national institutions. You can't have development if you don't protect people's human rights, etc. And that's the realization, and that's so we have this grand plan.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We would invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with any type of media outlet, be it a PBS or community access television station, or perhaps it's a university or some type of educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you just have an interest in our programs and you would like to share them, please do so. You're invited to download the programs and to distribute them at no cost. Global Connections Television is provided as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today we're talking with the ambassador from the permanent mission of Switzerland to the United Nations and talking about a variety of issues. My guest today is His Excellency Jurg Lauber. And we're talking about climate change, we're talking about human rights, and we're hopefully going to get the rest of them in here today. But before we go any further on, let's go to climate change. Every country in the world, as I understand it, according to the scientists, is being adversely affected by climate change. I know I've read articles on the Swiss Alps, beautiful, pristine area, but even they are being adversely affected with the contraction of the glaciers and snow. How serious is the problem in Switzerland, and what are your folks doing, and what are you doing at the UN to focus on climate change?
It's actually quite serious. People don't often think about that in the center of Europe, but we have permafrost, or we had up in the mountains, and this is going back. So what we see now is much more flooding, We have mudslides coming down the mountain, so it's fairly impactful. So what we do, we address it on a national level, of course. We're also much better now science-wise, finding what the reasons are, and we have a national program to adapt to these new changes, because you can't reverse them. You have to adapt and try to prevent future adverse developments. But then, of course, it's one of these classic issues that doesn't have national borders. We need to address it also internationally. So we ratified the Paris Agreement, and we try now also to help together with the other countries to really find the best way of implementing the Paris Agreement. So working on both levels, as so often national, but also international.
Right. As we speak today, every country in the world is a member of the Paris Climate Change Agreement, except the United States, which may change at some point. But how do you perceive the Paris Climate Change Agreement as far as it is voluntary, but do you think it's a strong step in the right direction as far as trying to bring the countries of the world together to deal with this problem?
Yeah, I think it was a fantastic breakthrough, because every country, or almost all of them, came together, at least in Paris at the point. And first, the acknowledgement that we have a problem and that we need to do something to address it. And then it's voluntary in the terms of how far you want to go. And for instance, our goals are quite progressive. We've committed to reducing our greenhouse emissions by 50% on 1990 basis until 2030. We also know that it's not enough, that we have to get better collectively. We need to do better, but I think it's a great start. Acknowledging the problem, start doing something, setting into motion. And also what happened yesterday and today in Paris on the initiative of the French government, trying to find new ways or additional ways of financing the measures we need to take. I see clearly progress.
And the scientists say that one of the best things we could do is to get off fossil fuels. Don't use coal, don't use oil, don't use gas. Well, we're going to use some of that, obviously. We have to for the moment. But some countries, as I understand, like Denmark, Costa Rica, different ones like that, are really moving to a fossil fuel-free society. Is Switzerland moving in that direction?
We're going in the same direction. We're going in the same direction. It will take time. It will take explanations. It will take new technology. But we're working very hard on that. Yes.
Now, Switzerland is a major player at the United Nations. Are there other international organizations, maybe dozens, we won't list all of them, but other key organizations that you're a member of, be it a European or international organizations?
It's very kind of you to say that, because as some people forget, we've only been a full member for 15 years.
That's right.
We entered 2002,
right.
The only country also that entered through a popular vote. But we've been active before, of course. On a European level, we are a member of the Council of Europe. We're not a member of the European Union, as a lot of people know, but of course we have very close relations to the European Union. We are a member of many other international organizations in the field of economic, Bretton Woods institutions, WTO. La Francophonie is an organization. We sometimes take a little longer to become a member, but we are so interdependent, and we know we are so interdependent, so global cooperation, regional global cooperation, as a means to really improve the fortune of the world is very much acknowledged, and we are very active in all these organizations.
That's quite a panoply. That's quite a few. Yes, it certainly is.
But if you look at the countries, the size, and the way we are interculturally connected in Europe and beyond, the way we are economically interdependent. We're also a migration country. I don't know if you know, we have more than 20% of people living in Switzerland are foreign residents. And we have about 8.5 million inhabitants, and a little less than 10% of that again living abroad. So 700,000 plus Swiss people live abroad. So very, very interdependent. And a global rules-based order is essential for us.
That is a good segue into the issue of migration. In migration, we've seen literally tens of thousands of migrants coming out of Africa and the Middle East, coming for many reasons, because of war, famine, whatever. Climate change, we see that's very prominent today. What is Switzerland doing to work with other European countries or with UN agencies to help these folks either to stay in their country or to stay near their country or to repatriate someplace else? Or what is the situation today? We don't read as much about it as we did a year ago.
Yeah, and it's really important also to understand that the issue of migration is actually much larger than what we've been talking about a year or 2 years ago, and that's one of the things I'm working on in this process I mentioned before, together with my Mexican colleague. For the last 50 years, anything between 3 and 3.5% of the world population was migrating. It's a phenomenon that's always been around. We also must not forget that most of the migration is actually interregional. South-south migration within the African continent, north-north within Europe is much, much, much larger than the movement from south to north. There's also north to south. We tend to forget that Europeans take it for granted to be able to migrate anywhere in the world. So we need to keep this in perspective. Now it's about addressing this phenomena you mentioned and managing migration better to make sure that, first of all, people have they leave by choice. They don't need to leave. So we need to help them economically. We need to help them in terms of better training, better schooling, institution building, so they leave of free choice. If they leave, make sure that they go to places where their skills are needed. Because US needs a lot of skills, high skilled, but also low skilled workers. All of this we're trying to do. We're trying to address these different aspects of migration.
Exactly. And the last, probably the hardest question of all of you mentioned UN management reform. We've heard about reforming the UN since, I guess, Kofi Annan came up with this two-track approach back in the 90s, and there have been a lot of reforms made at the UN. But the UN's a very different institution. The UN has administrative, organizational, and programmatic strengths, but it also has weaknesses because it brings all 193 countries together. In the last minute and a half we have, what reforms have been made or what could be made in the future to strengthen the UN?
I think right now what we need is to preserve the relevance of the UN, the changes that are happening. So one I already mentioned, we need to make sure that the UN is a good instrument to help member countries implementing the SDGs, the new development agenda. I think that's a key thing. We also need, and I say we because the UN is not an abstract body, it's all us member states together with the Secretariat, together with the new Secretary General. We need to get better at conflict prevention. Peacekeeping is important, but we need to get better at preventing conflict. We need to have more instruments, more resources. They need more people who know how to mediate, how to get in early to prevent the conflict. That's a few of the things. I also believe the UN needs to be an attractive, modern employer. We need to attract the best talent around the world. It's such a fantastic mandate that UN should have all the talent, the most talented, the brightest, most brilliant young people around the world clamoring on the doors to work for the UN. But sometimes, because it's a little old-fashioned, that's not really happening. So we need to make sure it's an attractive employer.
Exactly. And a lot of people believe the UN has millions of employees. It only has about 50,000. They think it's wealthy, which it's not. They think it's a one world government, which it's not. So there are all kinds of rumors and lots of misinformation out there about the United Nations. But it is a very important institution, and it's it's the only place that brings all the countries of the world together.
Still.
And what do you see as in the last 30 seconds, the top two issues that the UN will be dealing with as we move into the 21st century?
I think in general we really need to preserve this idea of a rule-based international order where countries come together and work together, also addressing all the issues, some of which we mentioned already. Again, peace and security is a concern right now. We see so many places where we move towards confrontation and escalation instead of diplomacy and working together. I think we need to strengthen diplomacy. And then again, the development, there's one phrase that really summarizes the whole new development agenda, and there's leave no one behind. And I think we need to be true to that, and we need to implement that, because it's not possible to elevate single countries on this planet. We need to elevate everybody. If not, the UN is the ideal platform for that.
Exactly. And it is the only platform, as we mentioned before, that brings these countries together. And in the past, as you very well know, so often countries tried to deal with problems either maybe one country or in a bilateral arrangement or maybe in a regional approach, and then when the situation got so bad, they bring it to the doorstep of the UN Security Council and say, here we go, we can't deal with it, please, you do it. And that has been the challenge of the UN. Of course, the UN has been underfunded over the past several years. You mentioned about getting the best and the brightest of personnel, and that is a major challenge for this organization, as other organizations too in the world, I'm sure. But again, Switzerland has played a key role before joining the United Nations. It's playing a key role now that it's involved in the United Nations, and I'm sure it will continue to play this very active role in the future. And Jurg Lauber, the permanent representative for Switzerland to the United Nations. It's been a fascinating conversation. We've covered a lot of different topics, and I want to thank you so very much for
thank you
a
much.
very
Thanks. It's a
interesting
pleasure.
and a very informative
Thank you much.
program.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank
Thanks.
you. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.